This is Kentucky Afield Radio. This is Ron Rohde, Kentucky Afield's first host back in 1953. Now, I'm proud to present Charlie Baglin.
Every time I think of how to begin the show today, I'm torn. Frankly, there are mixed feelings on the subject matter. Bees. We know they buzz and can sting, but we also know, or should know, they play a key role in the food we eat and wildlife eats. And that's not just limited to honey. So news of bees in decline should concern us. We go inside outdoors with bee experts next on Kentucky Afield Radio.
Tomorrow morning, I have a 6:45 meeting. It's with the sunrise. And those important clients, I brought them with me.
Look, Mom, a deer!
How do you measure success?
I have a feeling this day will outperform all others.
Did you see that fish? Let's go down to the lake.
It's great to be outnumbered. It's great to be outdoors.
The Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife, at work in the outdoors to bring out the best in you.
I may never score the winning touchdown.
And I may never win the 100-meter dash, but I might.
But I can score one for the outdoors with a Kentucky Nature's Finest license plate.
The bobcat, butterfly, and cardinal plates have helped protect nearly 100,000 wilderness acres across our great state.
And that's a win for us all.
Yeah.
I may never hit a hole-in-one to win the championship.
No, I may never kick that winning goal.
But the outdoors need a champion, and they have one in Nature's Finest plates.
They have one in you.
Welcome to Kentucky Afield Radio. This is Charlie Baglin. On an outdoor show like this, it's difficult, if not impossible, to talk about one animal and not talk about two or three others in the process, or two or three plants, or types of habitat. It's like a fabric out there. It's all connected. There are no lone rangers in the wilderness, from the largest animal down to the smallest insects and all the berries and the fruits and the nuts and the acorns. When one goes missing, it's similar to removing a thread from that fabric. In 2006, researchers did notice a thread, not missing per se, but becoming unraveled. And that raveling was honeybees, a marked decline of bees with no clear place to point a finger. We hear this subject pop up in the headlines on occasion, but today you're going to hear it for an hour. The wheres, the whys, the what happened, and what's happening now to correct it. My guests are the Kentucky State Apiarist Dr. Tammy Horn Potter. She is with the Kentucky Department of Agriculture, and beekeeper/researcher Fritz Vorisek. A big Kentucky Afield welcome to the both of you.
Well, I'm delighted to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you, Charlie. I'm glad to be here.
When we think about bees, guess what? I think about bee stings, especially little kids playing in the yard barefooted. And so I can understand how some people may have grown up believing bees maybe aren't our friends, or maybe they are pests. And that only paints one side of bees, or maybe just a little sliver of bees. Tell me a little bit about bees and their role in nature in Kentucky.
I think the general audience does have an apprehension about getting stung. More people are beginning to become aware of the importance of pollinators to their food production. And 35% of our fruits and vegetables need some type of pollinator to provide seed set. And a lot of people don't even realize just how important pollinators are to wildflowers. So when I'm talking to school children, what I will emphasize is that honeybees bring color into the world. They bring yellow, they bring purple, they bring those types of flowers that delight our senses and our smell. Flowers, honeybees co-evolved together millions of years ago. Prior to pollinators and flowers showing up, the world was a green place. There were lots of trees, but there weren't the flowers. And so I like to emphasize that when I'm talking about the importance of pollinators to people.
A third of our food supply is due to bees and pollination?
Absolutely.
That's a lot. That's quite a lot. Pollination is something I remember hearing about in grade school, maybe 7th grade general science class. And I never could quite make the connection between all this yellow dust that's out there that gets on our cars, say, and makes us sneeze in the spring, and the production of wildflowers and food. And it's still hard for me to grasp. Give me the Pollination 101 class.
Well, there are quite a few grasses that produce pollens, too. Trees produce pollen. I mean, that is a plant's way of reproducing itself.
So the bees aren't producing the pollen, but they're
the plants are.
The plants are, and the bees are moving the pollen around. The little specks of dust, are they like seeds?
They are, but it's important to make a distinction between the grass pollens that cause most people's allergies and the fruit and vegetable pollen that honeybees and other pollinators move from one plant to another in order to give us those fruits. So if you've ever been to a vegetable market and you've picked up a cucumber that looks a little distorted, it's misshapen, it may not have received adequate seed set. If you split an apple in two and it has too few seeds, that's a result of not having enough pollinators in that orchard at the time that blossom was open.
It strikes me that a bee just sort of goes about its life randomly. I don't know that a bee knows that it's actually creating wildflowers and food. Is this haphazard at best?
Well, actually, plants and trees and flowers actually are very important. They actually entice the bees in with nectars, and the bees will actually consume that, and as they do that, they actually will collect the pollen as well. And so they actually pollinate the tree, but the trees actually benefit the bees by, when they create nectaries, and they can bring that home and dehydrate that down into honey, what we have today.
And the other thing to throw into what Fritz is saying is that flowers have developed floral guides. The petals themselves act as landing strips for the bees to give them direction to where the nectararies are. And once those nectararies have been depleted, then the flower shuts down. It sends out a very small electrical signal so that the honeybees know not to waste time.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah.
I never knew that. I see a flower, a wildflower, I give it no further thought. There's a whole plan in place.
Bees can actually see a visual pattern more than what people can, actually. And so there's a UV, guides that bees can even tell if the bee had been there, actually, and already taken the nectaries.
Isn't that cool?
So it's a lot more organized than what maybe your general audience will realize.
Definitely it is. Health benefits of honey.
So honey has 14 antioxidants in it, and that can a lot of times contribute to people's immune systems. Many people have the perception that honey will help with allergies, but most people's allergies are caused by grasses and not by the flowers. So that's one benefit.
Honey can be used for a variety of different things. It's mostly a larger composite of sugars, which actually give you just the carbohydrate proteins for people to get through the day. But it also has a slight mixture of the pollen in it. And so with that, you can also get extra proteins out of it as well.
There have been some studies in New Zealand and Australia where they are using honey to pack wounds, and that makes the wounds heal a little more quickly. Many armies used to use honey as a kind of a wound salve, if you will. So some of these new hospitals are trying these other mechanisms that are ancient, but they help prevent things like MRS, the other types of bacteria that have become resistant to antibiotics.
Sweet. I was told once, and then tell me if this is a myth or if this is actually true, honey doesn't spoil.
Very much so. Actually, some of the Egyptian tombs actually have honey if it wasn't contaminated with a bunch of other products that it could still be consumed today, mostly sand. But the pH of the honey as well as the osmotic potential doesn't allow a lot of...
The osmotic potential. Stop. Tell me what that is.
The osmotic potential basically is if a foreign compound, say not necessarily botulism, but like other bacteria actually land in honey, that'll actually suck the moisture out of it and actually kill that bacterium.
It's magic.
We should stress, however, that just to be on the safe side, parents should not feed infants honey, infants that are under 1 year old, just to be on the safe side.
A lot of people will put honeybees or bees out there with mice and spiders and snakes and bats and everything else they don't like But if you know a little bit more about them, maybe you'll change your mind.
So there are over 4,000 native bees in North America, and some of those bees are very reluctant to sting. If we consider the mason bee, for instance, that bee simply cannot sting, but it's an excellent pollinator. It's an early spring bee. It tends to work orchards and provide seed set for cherries, peaches, apples, the orchard fruits. But that bee, it's a solitary bee. It has no interest in stinging.
I think I know where you're going with this. When we come back, I will ask why stinging is not what a bee really wants to do. I want to hear the answer. You're listening to Kentucky Afield Radio. We're back on Kentucky Afield Radio. This is Charlie Baglin. Bees are the topic today, the role they play in the wild world around us. Beekeeper and biologist Fritz Vorisek and Tammy Horn Potter, the state's expert on bees, are my guests. And in nature, we've grown up believing some things that simply aren't true. I've heard it said that a snake doesn't want to bite you. It is not its first line of defense. And now you're saying that bees don't want to sting. Fill me in.
Bumblebees don't want to sting. It's actually in the bee's worst interest to sting a person because obviously it pulls their abdomen out and they die. So
that bears repeating. If a bee stings, it pulls out its abdomen and the bee dies.
That's correct. I know that it's probably poor consolation to one of your listeners who has been stung repeatedly, but with honeybees, that bee dies immediately.
Then why do they sting?
To defend their home, to defend themselves.
That makes sense.
If you're around the colony, that's when you probably should take ease, actually. But if you're out in the field and the bees are actually visiting plants, normally they'd rather run away than do a sting.
The fear of bees, apiphobia. Not necessarily the fear of apes.
I didn't even know that there was a word called apiphobia. I'm learning too.
Have you heard of that, Fritz?
No, actually I haven't.
Apiphobia, fear of bees. At first glance, I thought it has to be fear of apes. But no.
I tend to think that in many cases, a lot of unfortunate stinging incidents happen with yellow jackets and wasps and hornets. And bees get a bad rap just because they are so visible and they're everywhere. Their numbers are bigger than, say, a wasp nest or a hornet's nest or a yellow jacket's nest. Those are ground nesters, the yellow jackets. I think bees end up kind of getting a bad rap.
So we're talking about bees, and there are many different kinds of bees. We're talking about honeybees, but you can't necessarily use these interchangeably. The orchard bee, the bumblebee, what I'll call a yellow jacket. Is a yellow jacket and a bumblebee the same thing? They're two different bees.
Oh, no.
And a hornet and a wasp, are they at least in the same family, or what's the story? And a fly, are they lumped in together somewhere?
Not at all.
In that great chain?
Actually, Hymenopteran, it would be the family name for actually most stinging insects. And so from there, you got the Apis mellifera, but then you've also got halictids, which are actually your orchard or solitary bees. And then you've got your wasps, which are, Vespides, as well as a couple others that I've...
So, I don't know, are there hundreds, are there thousands of different types of bees, let's just say in Kentucky?
So there are 20,000 types of bees around the world. There are 4,000 native bees in North America.
And there's about 10,000 pollinators, actually, which are bee honeybees. But a lot of them we're never going to see because they're solitary or very small and indiscreet. And over the last couple of years, we're losing a lot of those faster than we can even keep track of them.
Pollinators is a broader term than bees. Mm-hmm. It may include hummingbirds. It may include butterflies. It may include bats.
But then they're also, depending on the sugar concentration of your flowers as well as your corolla structure, that's what individualizes some of these certain bees actually to do certain things. Like bumblebees actually can go for a larger corolla, and they do a vibration actually to get that pollen out, while the proboscis, which is your bee tongue, can only reach down so far for a honeybee, so they choose a smaller corolla, basically.
So if you like tomatoes, for instance, those have a higher likelihood of being pollinated by bumblebees, which do that buzz pollination. But if you like something like apples, honeybees tend to work that because their proboscis can work that flower.
I had no idea. I'm glad that you two are on. So if we're talking about all these different kinds of bees, and we know we're going to talk about colony collapse disorder because we see on the news and CNN and wherever the headlines will say, oh, there's a decline in bees. Is this limited just to a bee or two, or is this all bees everywhere?
The acronym colony collapse disorder was first coined in 2006, and one of the things that the USDA has begun to do is to not use that acronym as often. It has been suggested that there are a lot of different reasons behind colony decline, which is the preferred phrase now.
Colony decline.
Colony decline. Again, it's a myriad of factors. At the top of the list is a varroa mite that is kind of like a tick on the bee, and it transfers as many as 9 different viruses to the bees. That's at the top of the list. There are obviously other factors. And
I suspect that the word insecticide is going to come up. Does that really play a role, Fritz? What have you seen?
I believe so, as well as herbicides. There's some sort of, it hasn't been proven yet, but I think there's been a crossover. I've got a small yard up in Gratz, actually, and they just treated it for spraying for herbicides, and immediately I saw a response from my bees.
So one of the things that I do as the state apiarist is I work with the USDA. I have a grant to take samples of both live bees and dead bees, and then also pollen. And what we are seeing now, admittedly, this is a small sample. Kentucky has just been included in this grant 2 years ago. What we are seeing from the pollen samples is that there hasn't been a lot of insecticides showing up in the bee pollen, which is the food. There are trace amounts, but what tends to be used more often are miticides. That's what's showing up in the pollen. And of course, these are beekeeper applied chemicals. Beekeepers need to apply these in order to keep the mite populations down. This year, we are actually switching from pollen samples to beeswax samples because the beeswax is the lungs of the hive. I'm in the middle of taking samples right now, but those results will be published in the December bee lines, which can be found at the Kentucky Department of Ag honeybee website.
Is this decline in bees, colony decline, more prevalent in one part of the country than another, or is it uniform across its habitat?
I think it depends. In other words, if you take a state like Georgia, which has the cotton industry, and they use an enormous amount of chemical applications, I think the losses in Georgia due to misapplied chemicals are probably much higher. And that's not to say that we don't have those cases in Kentucky, because we certainly do. We still have tobacco that's grown and needs a lot of chemicals. You will have the occasional tobacco grower out there spraying when the wind speed is well over 15 miles per hour against the label instructions. And so Kentucky still has those. But compared to other states like Florida, which has the citrus industry, and the citrus industry is trying to fight citrus greening, you have a lot more chemical use there, in addition to just other types of crops that need chemicals like strawberries. So Kentucky, we use chemicals, there's no doubt about it. The bourbon industry is located here. They use an enormous amount of acreage for corn. Corn now, for the most part, 95% of corn is coated with a neonicotinoid. It's coated with a chemical, and pollen from corn is very attractive to bees. So just because I'm getting these samples that suggest that maybe we're not suffering from major amounts of chemicals, we still have a lot to learn.
Neonicotinoid. I hear the word nicotine in that.
Correct. There is quite a bit, actually, and it's a spin-off of the natural plant form of nicotine. Basically, is an anti-insecticide that developed actually to protect itself from insects. And now that we have GMOs out there, actually, I've moved all my colonies away from soybean, which is about 98% actually neonicotinoid treated, as well as corn.
The European Union banned the use of pesticides there. I assume this was for cornfields. And it was reported they saw an improvement. Am I dreaming this, or was that actually a study?
Well, the European Union has a number of different countries, and I think you need to be specific about which one. For instance, when neonicotinoids were banned in France, they ended up having other unintentional problems. They had absolutely no weapons with which to fight things that tend to impact wheat. They saw major crop declines because the process of banning the neonicotinoids happened so quickly that they didn't have any more arsenals. Farming is chemical warfare, whether we like to admit that or not. And what's really optimistic in the United States is that we have a really growing organic farmer movement, because we understand that it's not natural to have so many acreages planted with just one thing, and it requires some kind of chemical shield, if you will. But the consequences of those chemicals are having detrimental effects on our pollinators. There is no question about that. And I want to stress the irresponsible use of chemicals is having,
sure.
If people follow the labels, that can make an enormous difference.
A difference for sure. The subject is bees, their decline, and hopes towards a recovery. We're here with Kentucky's bee lady, Dr. Tammy Horn Potter, and fish and wildlife biologist Fritz Vorisek. I hear our music playing. That means we need to get to a break. We have our weekly fishing report standing by. And is a light shining at the end of the tunnel? We'll ask. You're listening to Kentucky Afield Radio. Baglin back on Kentucky Afield Radio, and if you would like to hear this show again, or maybe share it on Facebook, or email the link to someone who is interested in bees, those links are easily found. You can go first to Facebook and just simply put Kentucky Afield Radio in the search box, and there we are. Also on YouTube, just put Kentucky Afield Radio and bees in the search box, you'll find us. And we're a podcast, weekly, on iTunes. Search for us there. More just ahead with our state apiarist. First up, our fishing report.
I have never seen anything like this.
I can't believe I waited so long.
What will you say?
My heart was pounding.
This is Kentucky. It's deer season, and it's
outstanding.
43 Boone and Crockett deer last year. Modern gun season opens November 11th, with archery season open now.
Yeah.
What do you say?
I can't believe I made the shot.
Get your license and deer permit now, and take aim on the thrill at fw.ky.gov.
At the Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife, we don't make the forest. We help make them more abundant. We don't make the streams. We make them clearer. We don't create wildlife. We help them exist in healthy numbers. We don't put nutritious venison, fish, or wild turkey on the dinner table. Or do we? The Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife. We don't make a lot of your outdoor experiences. At Kentucky Fish and Wildlife, we help make them better.
Charlie Baglin back here on Kentucky Afield Radio, our second half hour of the show. The state apiarist, that is the person in charge of bee studies for the state of Kentucky, Dr. Tammy Horn Potter. She's with the Kentucky Department of Agriculture. Also in the studio, a biologist and beekeeper with the Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife, Fritz Vorisek. So bees. It reminds me of DDT. This was an insecticide that put the bald eagle on the brink of extinction. DDT was banned in 1972, and now bald eagles are back stronger than ever.
I think if you were to just ban one chemical, you're still going to have losses. And it's not going to be the chemical's fault per se as much as it is the applicators. And to come back to my point about varroa mites, this particular mite transfers up to 10 different viruses. And so what I'm learning from the USDA Honeybee Health Survey, 50% of our apiaries are over what the USDA recommends in terms of mite threshold. That should be no more than 3 mites per 100 bees. We have colonies 13 mites per 100 bees.
Well, is there a means for the general beekeeper to correct this and make any change?
Absolutely.
Is it simple? Is it difficult?
There's many other holistic methods, actually, like, say, for instance, screen bottom boards, because mites will actually naturally fall off a bee under certain temperatures and certain movements. So screen bottom boards and a couple other techniques can minimize that as well.
You're a beekeeper, Fritz, both of you,
yes.
Beekeepers. I want to attach the word description of commercial beekeeper you are. Are you the same, or are you a hobbyist, or?
I'm considered a sideliner beekeeper because my colony count is approximately 60.
And you, Fritz?
Back in the 90s, actually, I was running 3,000 hives from Colorado to California, and that's what brought me to Kentucky State University, because as the time progressed, I noticed, like, every time we bring them back, I always thought it was a bit of stress driving through Death Valley, packaging them up, and moving them, but that's when the Varroa jacobsoni came on the scene.
Varroa jacobsoni,
yep.
Just so that we know.
Yes.
That's a type of mite.
That is the mite, yep.
Okay, that's the bad boy.
Yep, and now there's even a Varroa destructor is what they've actually identified as well. And that's
he might as well be a wrestler. I can see him. He's got the mask on. He's ready.
Yep, and so ultimately we were using like fluvalinates, which is just a simple chemical compound, actually, and that was, their half-life of a mite is actually pretty quick, and so they were getting immune resistant to actually that chemical. And so then we've upped the game to an organophosphates, and now we're doing quite a few others, actually, oxalic acids and whatnot, but they can actually get themselves immune. The ones that survive, like if it knocked out like 90% of them, that 10% is the one that survives, and they come on and they've got that immune resistance. So what we've done now is actually we discovered actually the honeybees themselves, the queens, actually have genetic characteristics, and that's what brought me to Kentucky State University as well, because we had native pollinators, actually native honeybees, that were surviving this blight, and we wanted to see exactly what was going on with that scenario. But we did notice actually a particular hygienic characteristic where these certain bees would actually nibble on the legs of the mites, and they would be in turn desiccated, which means dried up and died.
Yeah, we talk about the mite as if it's somehow impervious to any kind of defense, but mites are actually quite vulnerable. They are blind, and they can only reproduce in the bottom of the cells where the honeybees are, and even the male mites cannot leave the bottom of the cell. If you have a worker that is simply being more hygienic than its other sisters, that worker will bite on the legs of the mite, and that's enough to make the mite bleed to death. So those genetics are now being promoted by Purdue University and distributed through the region. Kentucky is quite fortunate. We've started a Kentucky Queen Bee Breeders Association, and it's specifically to help get those genetics in our state and distribute them across the state.
Fritz, you're a biologist, you're a fisheries biologist, and you love the outdoors. Now, let's say a few years down the road we really get a handle on this, and bees tend to stabilize. How is that going to improve the wild outdoors out there in general? Will it affect deer, rabbits, songbirds? What's the story?
I'd say everything across the board, actually, because the fruit set's going to be just that much better. There's going to be better foraging. Most of our products right here come from like early spring, where actually most people don't realize that maples actually are pollinated by bees in the very beginning. And then our biggest crop here is the black locust. And so with both of those in tangential, we're going to have more pollinators, more bees, more wildlife in general.
I think we're going to have a healthier ecosystem, as Fritz just mentioned. I think one of the problems that our beekeepers will face is the cheap imports of honey that are coming into the United States. So I don't want somebody listening to your show to think, oh, this is going to be my retirement package. Our bee populations are going to stabilize, which they are doing. I want to mention our losses this past year have actually been lower this past year. So
percentage-wise, how much lower?
So they went from 40% losses down to 33%.
That's a help.
And we think it's because people are much more aware about varroa mites and viruses, so that they're starting to be more proactive. This is for the state of Kentucky, mind you. But the thing that is going to undercut our beekeeping industry is that right now we still don't have a definition of honey in the United States. And so our state then imports close to 300 million pounds of honey to meet national demand. And, some of these honeys are contaminated with chloramphenicol. They're selling for 60 cents a pound. It's difficult for a beekeeper to make a living.
Let me just point blank. Is there light at the end of the tunnel for bees?
Yes, absolutely.
Do you see the light?
Yes.
How far down the road is it?
I would suspect that we're about 5 years from having better genetics in our state, and those genetics are about defensive behavior.
I had heard once, now I'm going to go back to this Harvard study, pesticides appear to play a key role, I'm reading, in killing off the honeybee population. According to the new study from Harvard, the authors wrote that pesticides might lead to the impairment of honeybee neurological functions, specifically memory. And I'm wondering if there's some validity to this. Do the bees just forget where the hive is? And they just don't know how to get home?
Bees are incredible because they have 20 different dances, actually, and they can actually generate the distance and the space during the time of the day that a forager does find, like a nectary, and that they can send the rest of the colony out there to collect what they need, the foragers, that is, to collect what they need. So I haven't heard about anything that except for a UC Davis study where actually they've got some sort of fly that actually kind of attacked the bees over in California, and that kind of made them a little delirious.
I'd like to point out one thing, which is that simply limiting one chemical, let's just say imidacloprid, because it's used so prevalently everywhere, it tends to ignore the complexity of the flowers. Okay, so for instance, if you take a flower like buckwheat, the nectararies of that flower turn on in the morning hours, and then they shut off in the afternoon. Sunflowers, it's the opposite. The nectararies are not on in the morning, and then they turn on in the afternoon. So there's a lot of complexity in the floral world that this talk of banning chemicals doesn't even begin to address.
Well, say, for instance, like this West Nile disease that's coming around here, just been recorded in Lexington. Now they're just going to carte blanche start spraying everywhere, too. And that doesn't address the fact that other insect pollinators as well are going to be affected.
I'd like to mention that Kentucky Department of Agriculture is about to launch an electronic communication tool so that if chemical applicators are applying a product where the label specifically says that beekeepers in the area need to be communicated with, then this electronic communication program will let that applicator go online, log the product, log the day, log the time, and then the area beekeepers will receive an email or a text message and give them some heads up that there will be a product that's toxic to honeybees that will be sprayed in the area.
That's good to know.
It will not be available until probably November or December, but the idea is to get beekeepers and applicators registered before the spraying for Zika virus in March of next year. That's our timeline.
That would make sense. While we're on the subject of the Department of Agriculture, your website, what is that? And I'm sure there's a lot of information out there people could just log on and read.
So the Kentucky Department of Agriculture Honeybee website has all of the monthly newsletters that I distribute to beekeepers and bee associations. It has Dr. Tom Webster's manual called Kentucky Beekeeping that's available for people to download for free. It's www.kygr.com/statevet, all one word, /honeybees. It has other information such as varroa mite treatments and also videos. There are links to these videos that are very short. People can download those without paying a screening fee. It has information about local bee associations, when they meet, where they meet. At the beginning of the year, we try to get information about the bee schools that happen in spring. Kentucky's very fortunate. We have about 6 bee schools. So we try to get that up on the website so people know where they can get education.
And I've seen your name, both of your names, on the last one that was over at K-State, Kentucky State University. You'll have to do that again. So I think it's important for your audience to realize that I'm in the office of the state vet. Okay. So if they go to the Kentucky Department of Agriculture, they want to find the state vet's office, and that'll pull up honeybees. If you just Googled Kentucky State Veterinarian, bees, would you be there in the first couple of options? In fact, if you were to go to KentuckyDepartmentOfAg.com, you could be there in 3 clicks. Okay. The long and short of it is you're accessible. So do you have an interest in beekeeping, an interest in healthier plant life around where you live? We will close with that subject in our final few minutes. Stay with us. You're listening to Kentucky Afield Radio. We're back with our final few minutes with Kentucky Afield Radio. My name is Charlie Baglin. Biologist and beekeeper Fritz Vorisek and the State Apiarist Dr. Tammy Horn Potter with the Kentucky Department of Agriculture. And out there on the side of bees, helping bees, the beekeeping community. One of my best friends has a few beehives. He's a master gardener as well. So he sees instantly and understands that relationship. Let's talk a minute about bee clubs.
We've got many clubs, actually, that have been forming over the last 10 years, actually. And our bee schools participation's gone up dramatically. So there's many forming since I haven't seen the last numbers. But there's a Kentucky State Beekeepers Association. How do you find them on the web? That's the Kentucky State Beekeepers Association, and you can find that at ksbabeekeeping.org.
I would just stress that one of the things that I'm optimistic about is that a healthy hive is one with overlapping generations. In terms of beekeepers, we haven't had that. We tend to be an older group. And one of the things that I'm optimistic about is that we're seeing a lot more FFA students. We're seeing a lot more 4-H. 4-H, in fact, in Kentucky, their entire focus this next year is going to be pollinators. They've created a pollinator ambassador program for all of the states to help nurture young beekeepers in these counties. So that's also part of my optimism, is that we finally, I think, are really working towards overlapping generations among beekeepers, not just the bees. I bet if you Googled beekeeping or bees, a ton of stuff is going to come up. One thing I didn't see, but I heard, I got to thinking, well, maybe this is true, because there was that magic year around 2006. Cell phones were really starting to blossom with use. I think the first iPhone was right around that era. And they were saying, part of the bee decline is through cell phone signals. It's, messing with their heads. I don't know how to say it better than that. But some people were blaming cell signals. Did you ever hear that? Was there any truth to that?
I've heard of it, but actually I didn't believe it, actually. Now, if you keep the bees directly under power lines, I have seen, localized effects, but not from cell phones directly.
Everything that I've read has suggested that it was actually a misinterpretation of the research done in Germany. It was simply a problem of translation.
A lot of what we've been talking about is clearly a mile over a lot of people's heads, but we have tried to keep it simple. But beekeeping and the production of honey is certainly not, and that's something that everybody loves, honey. Honey Nut Cheerios. That's good stuff. I knew a woman who put honey in coffee.
Honey barbecue.
Oh, yeah. So beekeeping, is that a hobby that you would recommend to people? What kind of space do you need to beekeep?
It's actually very little. People very successfully keep a small amount of hives in their backyard in suburban environments. People can keep a hive or two in the backyard, but communicate with your neighbors before you move those hives in, because if your neighbors just walk out one day and see hives are on their property line, that ends up creating some bad feelings.
Well, when you talk about telling the neighbors, it goes right back to that old fear, I'm going to get stung. If they live there, are they automatically going to seek you out to sting?
No.
Generally, it's a paranoia of possibilities, and so people just don't like that.
You can raise bees on a roof.
Rooftops are wonderful because they're out of people's line of visibility.
And a simple precaution of a large hedge, and if you bury the beehive in there, they have to fly up and over, so that'll get away from people's houses. People complain about pools maybe once in a while, only in a drought environment, but it's pretty rare.
There has to be something in proximity for the bee to fly to eat.
That's correct.
And then know to fly back. So what kind of general area do you need to have around your beehives? Woodlands? Do you need a creek? Do you need farmland? What?
So a local water source, like a small tributary around, would be nice, actually, to keep the bees out of people's local pools. But there's so many exotics, actually, out there, plants like honeysuckles, that they can work off that, and that's usually out in the fields or along power lines or vacant spaces.
You could transform a bird feeder into a bee waterer, but they do not like to have their feet wet, so you need to have something in that bird feeder like gravel or, styrofoam pebbles and something that the bee can land on while it's slurping up water.
So why do you beekeep?
I have a farm. I have a 100-acre farm, and it has an orchard on it, so I raise bees for the seed set. They need to pollinate my trees. The honey is a good byproduct. I eat it every morning, but there are practical reasons why I'm a beekeeper.
You do it to help the environment. Same with you, Fritz. Did you raise it for those purposes or maybe to make a little money?
A little of all the above, actually, and there's other products that you can collect out of beehive besides honey. Pollen's a great one, but I also collect propolis. Now, propolis is the bee glue that actually has a good pharmaceutical value as well as an antibiotic, antimicrobial, and you can use that for a variety of like tinctures and other compounds.
And we haven't even talked about beeswax, which makes a wonderful soap, a wonderful lotion, and the best candles in the world.
A lot of benefits to raising bees. And so anybody who has bees around them is going to have a better backyard. You look around the landscape around you, and it's going to have more wildflowers. It's going to have, if you have fruit trees, it'll have better fruit. The bees are doing all this, and they don't charge us a penny.
There's only 3 types of socialized insects, too, and that's the honeybee, the ants, as well as the termites. And so just that concept alone and the language that they speak and the pheromones that they exhibit actually are just phenomenal.
Define this word, swarm. The word swarm, a swarm of bees, in a lot of people's mind means, there's 1,000 bees, they're grouped together like a flock of birds, and they're coming to attack me.
It's a complete misconception. Actually, a swarm will happen when it's actually too big for its environment, and so they'll actually leave, and it's the most amazing sight to see because somehow the old queen gets kicked out while the new one's going to stay there, but all the bees from the hive will circle over that, and for whatever reason, half will leave with the old queen, and the rest will go back in the hive. Now, there's another possibility, too, it's called abstention, actually, where the bees are absconding, basically, from their beehive, and that's a whole other world. But when they're on the fly, they're really not too much to fear with. Actually, they fly slow to the ground, and they're just looking for a home at that point in time.
Being the state apiarist has to be an honor to be in that position.
Oh, it is. It's a privilege to be able to work with beekeepers in the state.
Well, thank you both for coming on the show.
Thank you so much, Charlie.
Been a good show. Interesting subject. What is the cleverest bee? Spelling bee. Joke 2, what bee is good for your health? Vitamin B. And lastly, why did the bee get married? Because he found his honey. It's true. I wouldn't make this stuff up. We are out of time. This is Charlie Baglin inviting you to go inside outdoors again next week on Kentucky Afield Radio.